What are you doing to? Hello, everybody. Salam. Welcome back to another episode of Justice for All Now. I'm your host, Hena Zuberi, and joining us on today's segment are my co-host, Aydin Anwar, fellow colleague, and one of our Save Uyghur campaign managers, and Se Hoon Kim, an alumnus and current graduate student at Rochester University, where he's heavily engaged in on-campus activism, organizing events primarily related to China, Tibet, and the Uyghur cause with different student groups. He has also worked on cultural preservation of Tibet and is currently learning more about the Uyghur people. He hopes to provide opportunities for individuals, particularly academic scholars, to look into Tibet and Uyghur issues in hopes that it will spread dialogue and bring about positive change that are peaceful and consistent with the values of a free society. Well, Ramadan Mubarak to you too. Today we will be discussing Ramadan in East Turkestan, the Chinese government's restrictions on fasting during Ramadan, and what students in activism can do from home during the COVID pandemic, and what students can do once the pandemic is over and are back on campus. So without further ado, I'm going to call in my guest today. Thank you, Se Hoon Kim, for being here, and thank you, Aydin, for co-hosting.
Thank you.
So let's talk a little bit about Ramadan. A lot of us are here in our homes, we're fasting, we're able to celebrate. I'm able to wish you Ramadan Mubarak. Aydin, I wanted to discuss a little bit about how Uyghurs celebrate Ramadan. What is the diaspora going through during Ramadan? And what are people actually in East Turkestan? What do they go through under persecution by the Chinese government?
Thank you. Well, first of all, Ramadan Mubarak to all those who are watching. I would say that Ramadan, particularly every year for the past several years now, it's been a really painful experience to think about, you know, the fact that we are here abroad able to fast and observe our religion freely. We go to Tarawih prayer, we break our fast with our families. We're able to say Ramadan Mubarak to each other. But what makes it particularly harder for us is even now, and I'm particularly referring to Uyghurs in diaspora who are not directly under Chinese oppression. Like right now, we can't, like I couldn't even call my relatives to say Ramadan Mubarak or to basically ask them how they're doing and ask how Ramadan is going, because for me to even do that, I would be endangering them and possibly sending them to a camp or a prison because they got a phone call from someone abroad who China will then link to as to someone who is possibly tied to terrorist activity, and then use that as a reason to put someone into a camp or prison. So I can't call them. And even if I were to call them, there's a high chance that they wouldn't even answer because of fear of persecution. And beyond that, obviously, it's also painful to think that like my own family members can't fast. They can't say the word God. They can't observe openly and worship the way we are. And even if people think, okay, you can maybe at least worship from home, no one would even see you. You can do it secretly. But even that is not possible because right now China still has over 1 million Han government officials living inside Uyghur homes to make sure people are not engaging in religious activity and to assess their political views and to basically report all that to the government. So you have literally government officials sleeping in your homes and oftentimes sleeping in the same bed as you to make sure that you're not engaging in these practices. So, and now we had...
You said a little bit about that. I mean, this is something that our audience members need to really understand, especially those of us who are used to going to mosques and used to going to prayers at the mosque, and what we're going through right now because of COVID, and the mosques are closed, we're not allowed to pray. So talk a little bit about that, how that's at least we can pray at home. Like this really hits me. That not being able to pray in the sanctity of your own homes, not being able to fast because of the surveillance. What does that look like? What does surveillance mean? Like break it down into terms like if you were back in East Turkestan and you got up in the morning and decided to open the lights up so you could prepare a morning suhoor meal for your family, what would happen?
So, I mean, this is like really interesting because I remember seeing how a lot of people were like talking about how heartbroken they were, the fact that they couldn't go out to the masjids this Ramadan. And obviously, I don't want to downplay everyone's feelings because this is real. This is still a really sad time for everyone, and people are still trying to adjust to this new way of worshiping from home. But now people are starting to see like the benefits of it. They're starting to see that there's more blessings coming out of it because they're spending more time with their family and are being more productive and so on. But, you know, I sometimes like to remind them, be like, at least you can pray in your own home, you know, like at least you're not being surveilled, you're not being punished or threatened to be sent to a prison or camp because you're doing that. Like let's keep these things into consideration, be grateful for what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is like blessed us with, because there are people who again have it infinitely worse. And going back to your question of, you know, what it's like to have someone be surveilling you. I mean, I haven't lived through that directly, so I don't want to speak on behalf of that kind of feeling and say this is what it feels like. But I feel like we can try to put ourselves in those shoes. I think that even for some time, I remember there was even reports talking about how government officials were actually be walking through neighborhoods to see who has the lights on during the suhoor time, or the time period where before sunrise, where people end up eating their meals to get prepared for the rest of the day. The Chinese government would actually make sure that these people don't even have their lights on to ensure that these people are not fasting. And even if they manage to fast, or even if they manage to have that feast in the morning, oftentimes in school and in workplaces, they would actually be forced to show that they're eating. So the schools or workplaces would force them to eat and show that they're not fasting. And so I think we have some things to showing that this is the reality for a lot of students, and also they're also forced to vow that they're not fasting and sign these these forms and whatnot, and to basically prove that. So, and in addition to that, obviously, and one thing I do want to mention is obviously there had been thousands of mosques that have been prevailing all throughout East Turkestan that had been, packed in history. And now those mosques are completely empty. Many of them have actually been razed to the floor. And a lot of them are very holy sites for the people of East Turkestan for centuries. We even have the shrine of Imam Jafar as-Sadiq, who is an 8th century scholar and a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So his tomb is not there, but it's a shrine, it's a maqam, and it's one of the 5 holiest sites for the Uyghur people that has shown to be destroyed. Many historical mosques have also been razed to the ground. And even if China decides to keep up a mosque and not necessarily decided to raise it, they end up using these mosques as basically a show for tourists to say, hey, religious freedom does exist. Look, this mosque exists. But they also convert these mosques into cultural propaganda centers. Oftentimes, they even put the portrait of Xi Jinping up on the mihrab or in the direction of the qibla, or where the direction that Muslims prayed and when they're pray. And so you can see how China is literally trying to just shift everyone's loyalty from God to the Communist Chinese Party. And so here you can see these are actually pictures coming. This was actually a tweet shared by a China scholar and an academic showing how these students were forced to basically vow and eat during the daytime, showing that they're not fasting during the month of Ramadan. So this is just one example, and there's also other disturbing videos that were being circulated showing Uyghurs and other Muslims there being forced to drink alcohol and eat food and in the broad daylight. So this is just something, again, this is just the tip of the iceberg as well. I feel like I remember oftentimes when we'd be talking about the oppression of the people of East Turkestan, everyone loved to say, oh, these Muslims can't fast. These Muslims can't fast, which is true. But it's I feel like the oppression would then be equated to just that is the issue, or that's the main issue. And it's I feel like people would just kind of listen when they would hear the term Uyghurs, they'd be like, oh, these are the people who can't fast during Ramadan. And that's pretty much all they would say. Or maybe they would know a couple things, but I'm like, it's much more than that. This is part of a much greater campaign to wipe out who the Uyghur people are culturally, linguistically, historically as a nation, because Islam is such an integral part of their identity. And by erasing the Islam, you're erasing their identity and basically increasing that effort to homogenize the rest of China, because their essential goal is to make us into Han Chinese people, and they want East Turkestan, which is an occupied land, to essentially basically be very visibly part of China, even though historically that whole land and that whole area, our culture, our language, our architecture, every part of our nation is very much different than the rest of China proper. And I don't want to say the rest of China, because East Turkestan is not a part of China, even though we are occupied. And that's one thing I want to emphasize, because I think that's a common misconception. People think we're just an ethnic minority that's been living within China for many, many years, when in reality, we've been living through an occupation.
So I think there's a question actually from Yahya Ali. Does China go to these extremes with other religions in the country, or are these attacks based on the history of East Turkestan and China?
So that's a good question. I think nowadays China has been increasing its crackdown on other religions, including the Hui Muslims. So they have been destroying their mosques, controlling the way that their religion is practiced. There's something called the Sinicization of the religion. So they're basically trying to make Islam Chinese, even like adjusting the Quran, changing the scripture, even replacing the term God with CCP. And so we're starting to see increasing crackdown on Hui Muslims, Christian, Buddhists, and other religions. But I will say that the type of oppression that we see in East Turkestan is very particularly focused. And there's a reason for that. And the main reason is the fact that this is part of an occupation and that there's a territorial claim to this land. And because China sees East Turkestan as this very mineral-rich region that China really relies upon, it's doing its best to basically maintain tight control over that region and using religion as an excuse to crack down on the people of East Turkestan. So that's one thing that I think because even the Hui Muslims, if this was purely about religion, if this was only if this was only about China's crackdown on the war, crackdown on terrorism, then they would also be equally cracking down on the Hui Muslims. But you would see thousands of Hui Muslims being rounded up into camps, being subject to the same forms of surveillance and the same forms of discrimination that Uighurs and other Turkic people are facing. But that's not really the case. And I'm not saying this to downplay the oppression that Hui Muslims are also facing and other religious groups, but that I would like to point that out because I think there is a common misconception that this is purely about religion and that this is about China just trying to get rid of this religious practice. But I wanted to kind of like illustrate the bigger picture in this regard. Again, this is a territorial claim, and China is using religion as an excuse to basically continue clamping down on us. And now, since 9/11, the September 11th terrorist attacks, China is using the global war on terror that was launched by the U.S. to basically justify their actions, saying that they are going to add and they're going to help with this war on terror and basically crack down on these so-called, they call Uyghur people who are seeking independence, they call them terrorists, they call them separatists, and they call them extremists. So they call them the three evils that require to be cracked down upon. And I do want to mention that, obviously even the term separatism is problematic in these cases because separatism implies that people have always been a part of China, when in reality we are an occupied territory, we're an occupied people. So calling people who are seeking independence separatists is again basically playing with the narrative that we're just simply people who've been living with China for so long, and now all of a sudden we just want to split. So that's one thing again I wanted to point out because again that's something that a lot of people usually forget out of the narrative.
So there is that's a really key point because there are those nuances. And just to answer that part of his question about Christians or other organized religion that is oppressed in China as well. So I did want to mention some of that. So perhaps I'm going to read off some of the findings of the USERF report on China that just came out yesterday, the annual report. And so they find that in 2019, religious freedom conditions in China continued to deteriorate. The Chinese government has created a high-tech surveillance state utilizing face recognition and artificial intelligence to monitor religious minorities. And on April 1st, a new regulation requiring religious venues to have legal representatives and professional accountants went into effect. Some smaller religious venues, especially in rural areas, found these requirements quite impossible to fulfill. And then, they go into obviously what is happening with the Uyghurs, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, and other Muslims who have been detained in the concentration camps. Some of the other findings that were particularly interesting, aside from the issues that we usually work on, was that, and then we've been talking, actually, I wanted to bring up this point that we have been talking about a lot in the past month, is that during 2019, and this is the U.S. Commission for International Freedoms annual report that we're talking about, they found that camps increasingly transitioned from re-education to forced labor, as detainees were forced to work in cotton and textile factories. And outside the camps, the government continued to deploy officials to live with Muslim families. So this is also documented in their report. And so any of these daily activities, like we were talking about in the beginning, fasting, praying, is reported as signs of extremist religious behavior. And so we'll talk about that a little bit more, as you were saying, this crackdown on terrorism is an excuse. They also note that the Chinese government continued to pursue a strategy of forced assimilation and suppression of the Tibetan Buddhists, and demonstrated that they demonstrated by laws designed to control to control how Buddhists even look at the Dalai Lama and other aspects. Then monks and nuns who refused to denounce the Dalai Lama were expelled from their monasteries, imprisoned, and tortured. And then during the summer of 2019, authorities demolished thousands of residents of Tibetan Buddhist centers in Sichuan province. And they note that hundreds of Protestant churches were closed down in 2019, including Rock Church, which is in Henan province, and another church in Beijing. Some of the congregants were released after they were arrested, but in 2019, they charged the pastor with subversion of state power and sentenced him to 9 years in imprisonment. So to answer the brother's questions, yes, inside China, aside from the Uyghur population, other religions are still being targeted. And however, what is happening to the Uyghurs, it has many, many more nuance and many, many more aspects to it. And this is why it's so important to learn the history of that land, to learn, it's essentially the way I look at it. If Pakistan tomorrow was annexed by China and the Pakistani people were converted and their practices and this entire thing happened to them, that is how different, just as the Pakistani culture is very different from the Chinese culture, the language is very different from the Chinese language, that is how we understand that, right? So if this is exactly the same way that East Turkestani culture is different from Chinese culture, if that makes sense to our readers. Our audience. I'm used to having readership. So there are, so Sadiq, someone's asking if we could post a link to the report on the Save Uyghur Facebook page. Inshallah, we'll do that. And thanks for the answers. Another question that someone else had was, what are the economic state of Muslims in China and East Turkestan? How much do Muslims contribute to the Chinese economy? So this is a bit off topic for us today, Brother Ilyas, but we'll hope to take that up in another perhaps show, maybe a little bit down, unless Se Hoon, you want to say something about that, or is that, I know you do a little bit of research on some of these topics, if you have a comment, otherwise we'll move on.
Sure. One thing, at least, I'm not an expert on this issue, but one thing we do hear about what's happening to the Uyghur people and just labor in China in general is that recently Uyghurs were forced into labor when these pandemics were going on, and a lot of the products that are being used in the international arena, it has been contributed by Uyghur labor, and so I would definitely recommend everybody to please do a lot more research on that, because of the fact that when we talk about the economy itself and dealing with the Uyghur people within China, it's not only deemed essential, quote unquote, by the Chinese government, but it's something that is also being used to run their economy, at least partially, and it does in a sense play a big role, in my opinion. And I think that would be a good stepping stone in terms of looking at how much they, quote unquote, contribute to the economic state of China itself. But
okay, thank you so much for that. So we have a question. She doesn't know if this has been discussed, but what are the conditions of these camps during, and we refuse to call them re-education camps, because many of the people who are in these camps are highly educated, professors, PhDs, doctors. These are essentially concentration camps. But so just to say that, but what are the conditions in the camps? What have we heard so far? I know we had a discussion on this about a week ago, and has there been any news since as the week has passed, and especially as Ramadan has come in?
So with what I know, I know that, I personally haven't gotten information or heard anything new. That's what makes it so devastating, is the fact that we don't know what's happening on the ground and to what extent. But what we do know is, based off of what we're seeing in the rest of the world, the coronavirus, we see that there are many prisons that have been infected around the world, and how even there are certain places that have started releasing these inmates and prisoners with fear that if these people stay in these prisons, that it's just going to rapidly spread and basically kill everyone or infect everyone. So hearing that, and also knowing that in February there was like 4 prisons in eastern China that had coronavirus inside them, and that hearing that over 500 people got infected, hearing that, it makes us worry. Okay, if that's what's happening in eastern China in 4 prisons, think about how many people are being infected in these camps and prisons in East Turkestan, where millions of people are being held, and obviously these are all innocent people who have been put into these camps for arbitrary reasons. We're thinking that China is obviously is using coronavirus as a way to expedite this process of erasing these people, because again, there's no mentioning of what's happening in these camps. Many activists had even set up a campaign called hashtag Who to Urumqi, World Health Organization to Urumqi, to send delegates to East Turkestan to assess the outbreak and make sure that it's being dealt with. But China responded to this campaign by saying that, this is a bogus campaign because everyone has already been released from the camps, and that it's nothing to worry about, and so on. And even if people were released from these camps, we have to keep in mind that there are still thousands upon thousands of people in prisons that are being held, and these prisons are arguably worse than these camps. And I talked to Uyghur former political prisoners that talk about the torture that they went through, the fact that that the women get raped, and the type of hygiene, the type of lack of hygiene that people are seeing, the spread of diseases and tuberculosis and HIV. And it's honestly a really terrifying, just without coronavirus itself, what's happening in these prisons is already a horrific occurrence. So adding the idea of that coronavirus is now infecting people in these camps, which honestly, I do believe that it's already infected these camps, but we just don't have clear, open, verified information on that, just given what we're seeing with the rest of the world, and the fact that China, is systematically already trying to punish us. I don't see why China would not basically put these people to kind of subject these people to the virus. So, but so just thinking about that, and also beyond what's happening in these camps and prisons, I also don't have much information on how it's affecting the rest of East Turkestan. But I had heard that now China has brought back, a few weeks ago, that they had brought back people to go back into society and continue working, going to school, and so on. So, and also thinking about the proximity of East Turkestan with China proper versus the proximity of the U.S. and kind of China, and how the fact that U.S. is literally on the other side of the continent, and we're seeing over 1 million cases surge here. It's honestly, it's for me, it's like easy to think about how bad the situation could be over there, and how it's being dealt with.
If I can jump in there a little bit, I would also like to add the fact that the effects of the concentration camps itself arguably makes it even a lot worse for the Uyghur people during this pandemic than any other group that's out there. The reason is because it's not just psychologically affecting them in general, even if they were released. There was, and again, societally, a lot of times I see, when I see reports that, oh, they have been released. The reactions that we may see are like, well, at least they're released, they're out in society, it might be fine. That's really not true, because the effects of the concentration camps are still there. I've actually communicated with 2 of the former concentration camp survivors, and they are, till this day, they are struggling to a point to cope with society itself. Thank God they are doing a lot better than before. But also at the same time, this whole pandemic with the Uyghur people has also hit millions of Uyghurs across the world, including my fellow panelist, Aydin over here. She, like her and many other Uyghurs who are in exile today, the fact that they can't celebrate Ramadan and, just spend time with their families back home, that's not the only hurt that they're facing. They're also facing, this unimaginable horror and hurt within, like, deep within their heart, because of the fact that both their families back home have now both have to endure the pain of concentration camp, but also at the same time not knowing what really happened to them, especially during this pandemic. And even if they are alive, I mean, what is the guarantee that they're not infected with the virus? And even if they're infected with the virus, what's the condition that they're in now? So this uncertainty itself is causing a lot more pain and harm than we could ever imagine for the Uyghur people. And I feel like that's something that really needs to be noted.
Definitely. Yeah. And this is a good segue into what we wanted to discuss. A lot of times when people look at this crisis and they look at it as just that, like a crisis, right? And they don't realize that this is systematic. This is something that it has happened before in other parts of the world. And it is not just an erasure of someone's religion or culture, even though that is as horrific as it is. This is a physical genocide as well, because it is wiping out a whole segment of not only just that society, but that entire region, right? So it's not just like, okay, if we talk about other, for example, terrible genocides that have taken place, this is even far beyond that. Like, that happens maybe to a certain segment of society, that a certain population, a certain race. This is an entire, like, I can't even put, when I look at the map of East Turkestan within that whole thing, that how China, when they build out that this is China, and how large that portion of China, quote unquote, is East Turkestan, the millions of people in that. So that just the enormity of this crisis or this oppression is what I think a lot of people don't get. And for that, we need academic scholars to study this and to speak up and to talk about this and to really stop, take off those blinders that they've had. Like, I feel like for the past 2 years, people have been just talking about this crisis in these, terminology that doesn't really get deep into the roots. So I really want both of you to discuss this. Aydin, you're a recent graduate from a school that, you know, there are scholars there who there's an Islamic studies department, there's scholars who study genocide, terrorism, all of that over there. And we've spoken to some of them, and hopefully we can have some of those professors come on board and present on these topics. But I know this is a passion for you, Se Hoon. If you could, and correct me if I'm saying your name wrong, because when people say my name wrong, I hate it. So yeah, let's talk about that.
So I'll quickly add to this. I know that topic of the fact that this is more than just a cultural genocide has been something that I've been kind of always pushing for and saying for a while now, because I think when people say cultural genocide, or let's say if I was an outsider and I heard the term cultural genocide, I would think that this is just an attack on culture. So it means, okay, my language is being erased, my maybe religion is being erased, and I'm just basically my culture is being, as the term implies, my culture is being eradicated. And I feel like from an outside perspective, that may not seem as bad, because it's like, okay, at least they're not being killed, at least, you know, they're still living, maybe they can still have faith in their heart and like go about it, they can maybe secretly speak their language, but it's much more than that. And I cite examples of, for example, what's happening inside these prisons and camps and these facilities where we have testimonies being released talking about forced sterilization. Forced sterilization is a physical manner. You are basically, you know, physically preventing the next generation of Uyghurs from existing. That is a physical phenomenon, right? And then you also have things like transferring of children, or like forced separation of children from their parents. Up to 500,000 or more Uyghurs have been separated from their families. That is a physical phenomenon. Like, and people can argue against this and saying that, you know, there's like these conditions of genocide that must be fulfilled. But even when you go to those conditions, all of them have been fulfilled. And people may argue that also some of these may not have been independently verified, or we don't have enough evidence to basically make that claim yet. But that's part of the problem, is that China doesn't allow us to basically gather that information freely, even if we want, if we try to, and obviously we've been trying to. But it's like, to what extent do we stop? Do we try to, like, you know, pay attention to the words that are coming out of our mouth until it is then too late? I mean, like, people are then wiped out. You know, we have testimonies of former prisoners. Mihrgul Tursun, right? She's now living in Virginia. She was released from the camps because she was an Egyptian citizen, and Egypt basically vouched for her release. But she talks about, and in her cell alone, there were more than 60 women in her cell, and that during the 3 months of her detention, over 9 women died, right? So if you kind of do that math, I know people may argue you don't have enough of a sample size to be able to like make a generalization about how many people are dying, but we went ahead and did it. We did the calculation, and we said, let's say we take the very conservative estimate that over 1 million people are in these camps or prisons, and then we multiply that number 9 by her statistics of 68 women, or over 60 women being in the cell. Then we estimated that in 3 months alone, over 300,000 people would have died from what's happening. And this is just, again, one number, right? And we can further, and this also excludes children that are being subjected to abuse, torture, and death in orphanages or wherever else they're being held, and also the people outside of these camps and prisons who are being subjected to you know, these forms of oppression that are then being left alone. I mean, left uncared for by their parents that are being in detention camps. And also there's just been increased you know, what's it called? I mean, there's been increased reports of, you know, tuberculosis and organ harvesting in these camps, exactly, right? And those are all physical needs. Exactly. So when people say it's too much to say it's physical, like I don't agree with it, and I'm not afraid to just openly say that this is what's happening. This is what we know so far. But think about what we don't know. And I think the prisons are the one place where governments can get away with bloody crimes and not be held accountable for it, because these are behind closed facilities that are, you know, that are blocked off. You have people serving, you know, 15, 20-year prisons for wearing the hijab, right? Think about what's happening to those people. The thing is, when we hear news that people are being sentenced to this many years, the question that goes through my head is like, are these people even going to come out alive or normal? Are these even normal prisons? The fact that
they do come out alive, there's reports of them dying within 2 weeks of leaving the camp. So
or even if they're released, they're talking about how people are then mentally deranged because they were forced to take drugs that cause memory loss and mental derangement, or the torture was so intense that they became so traumatized that they can no longer be themselves after these camps. So you are physically, even if these people are not necessarily dying, you are basically erasing who we are as a people. If people are coming out traumatized, they will be traumatized for the rest of their life, and it's going to be a very long healing process, and it might take generations, and this generational trauma will continue to last for however long it takes until we continue until China stops what they're doing.
Just to add to what Aydin was also saying, the crisis that we see, even with the pandemic itself, I mean, the uncertainty, the unclarity that we're facing from the Chinese government. Till this day, we literally have no idea where the origins of the virus actually came from. There are assumptions and there are theories behind it, but it's honestly, the world is in the dark right now, and unfortunately, it really shouldn't be. When I say this, I would like the audience to please pay attention to this, is that the Tibetans and now the Uyghur people have paid a heavy price in terms of warning the world about these sort of acts by the CCP. Not being clear, but also at the same time, as time goes on, discovering the fact that a lot more horrendous things have happened. I mean, things like that have been the reality within China since God knows when, right? I think that's another big point that we have to realize. And one other point about the fact that the Uyghurs themselves, especially, have paid a very heavy price for it. We see these concentration camps going on, and we see this torture. We see the reports of these tortures. We hear the testimonies of those people that survived these camps. But yet we don't see as much of a global outrage as one might have expected. I'm sure there are many reasons behind that. But one thing that I would like to point out is the fact that the more we don't talk about it, and the more that we are silent about it, is giving away opportunities for us to really find out the truth about what's really going on and what are the motives behind it. And just to add to all of my points is that when we look at the plight of the Uyghur people or even the Tibetan people, it's not just their plight that we need to focus on. It's the principles that are driving those situations to happen in the first place. What are these principles? Why is it that when Tibetans or the Uyghur people or the Chinese Christians, the Falun Gong, we hear about these issues about it, the word CCP always comes up, right? And I think as a global society, it has come to, I would guess, the right time, and it has always been the right time, as I would argue, to make inquiries about this and to really look into it. And as a global community, this is the time to speak up about it. One of the reasons is because we are facing a pandemic that originated from the country where the CCP rules, where everything is decided upon by the decisions of the CCP. And so it would be, in my opinion, it would be the most unfortunate things that we could ever do in this entire century if we're mum about it and if we're silent about it.
So let's talk a little bit about what can universities, what can students do? Let's start with universities themselves,
right.
Especially academic scholars. We'll talk about that, and then we'll move on to then what are things that students can do.
Well, as a student and as a student that has organized events since 2012, being an undergrad at the University of Rochester, one thing that really stuck out in my entire experience was the fact that we have to focus on the right principle. And that principle itself is a principle of not only spreading dialogue, but to present issues to encourage every individual to look into that issue and investigate that issue and research that issue as much as possible. One of the reasons I feel like, the issue of the concentration camp, or the entirety of the Uyghur issue, or even the Tibet issue, or even any other issues that are regarding China is not looked upon as much as other issues in the world per se, is one of the reasons is because, yes, we don't have a lot of access into those areas. We don't have access into a lot of the information that are coming out of it, other than the fact that, yes, we see here the statistics, we hear some of the testimonies that are coming out from those areas. That's one thing that we really, that's not really under our control. But the other thing that I want to also focus on is the fact that, we do this dialogue in order to be consistent with the principles that are given to us every day, especially here, in the sense that, when we're in an environment where we can freely talk about issues, whatever issues that may be out there, it is our job to not only research the issue, but actively engage with the issue as much as we can. That's part of the reason why I'm here today. That's part of the reason why I organized it. I organized all these events with various groups throughout the years, and to really get everyone to understand that what's happening to the Uyghur people, especially, is more relevant to us than ever before, because the same government that is causing all of this plight will be causing the same amount of pain, if not much worse, in the future if we just let it go by. And so I think that's something that we really need to remember, as students. But again, as students, we are also in an academic environment, and we have to be consistent with such environment. Now, there is a very big positive side to this, in the sense that let me share a short story regarding one of my experiences. A few years ago, I've organized an event about the Tibetan crisis. And obviously, during the event, we had a few students from mainland China, just basically asking very, very aggressive questions. They were asking, they were making statements of their own when it was not their turn. And overall, there was a lot of emotion that's involved, understandably, from their side. And one thing that really captured my attention is when one of them came up to me and said, "Why do you do this? Why are you organizing these events?" And pretty much making it sound like, any criticism of the CCP itself is all of a sudden a criticism of the Chinese people, or racism towards the Chinese people, which really is not the case. As a matter of fact, the response that I gave to that student was, "Well, here's the thing though. Did you come here on behalf of the CCP?" She said no. I said, "Okay. Did you come here on behalf of yourself?" And she said, "Yes." And I told her, "Well, if that really is the case, then, I think I've accomplished what I already wanted to accomplish, in the sense that you who have disagreed with me chose to come here, voice your opinion out in a free setting that allows you to, right?" And I told her, if I'm wrong, then I am wrong, but please prove that I'm wrong. But that is the environment that we are in. And also at the same time, I really would like to encourage you to look into this issue as an individual, not as somebody, who was educated in the Chinese system, or somebody who is just another international student. I asked her, "What's your name?" And, I'll use an alias here. She said, "My name is Jennifer." I said, "Okay, Jennifer. At this point, when you think about these issues, don't think about it as anything else but as Jennifer, because you're the only person with the exact type of DNA, with the exact type of genes that you have, and you're the only one with that person in this entire universe with those characteristics." So I would 100% recommend that you look into this issue as an individual for the first time. A few months later, she came back and she said, "This actually accomplished a lot of things for me." She said, I found out, why the Tibetans have been, protesting all these years. I've also found out that, why there's so much problems that we just couldn't understand over the years. but also at the same time, I also really like the fact that, I thought about this for the first time as an individual. And so that's the type of driving principle that has to be behind it, because at the end of the day, we're not better than, anybody. We are on the same equal footing. And especially when it comes to the students from mainland China, it is because we think of them as individuals, and as individuals that does also deserve same amount of respect as anybody else. We challenge them with these issues. We present what's happening in the concentration camps, in the hopes that maybe as an individual, even they can come one day and really participate in this change that's direly needed for the Uyghur cause, even for the Tibetan issue and whatever. And now, just on a last note, I think as students, the other thing that we could do is not just only organize talks or get these dialogues going. There's a lot more creative things that we could that's available out there. One of the things that students can do is just actively talk about it in their classroom when it's appropriate. I've heard cases where students would go to their professors and just come up with ideas where they can convert this into their academic thesis. Anything like that. That could be an amazing opportunity for every student to participate in any way, shape, or form. Do you have to go out there and protest? No, but it is one of the things that you could do. And I think another thing is that students really need to realize that there are a lot of options out there where you can participate, where you can help out with the Uyghur issue. The question is, what is the most appropriate for you, and what is the most relevant to you in terms of what you can do. And let me just add by saying that I've actually I'm a big fan of cooking, for example, right? And one of the things that we could do during this pandemic is I'm actually learning to make how to make it's called the Uyghur, in Uyghur it's called lakman, something like that, make it and then just put pictures on it on Facebook or whatever, just to really get this idea going with the fact that, hey, even as non-Uyghurs or non-Muslims like myself, it is important enough for us to participate in this cultural protection and preservation. Why don't you do the same? And even challenge other people. Why can't you do the same, right? So that we may all do the right thing, because at the end of the day, this is not just an Uyghur issue anymore. This is a human issue where no matter what background you come from, it needs all the support that it could get. Yeah.
Definitely. And one thing that when you were talking about what students can do, I really urge students that they can get involved politically as well. When you pick up that phone and make that call, they're not asking you whether you're a student or whether you're a 70-year-old. You're a constituent. And when we look at the statistics of the people who are calling and making those, a lot of times that bracket of people is missing. And this is something that I really want to push to young people is pick up the phone and make that call. Call your congressperson, call your senators, go visit, make demands, write the letter, get that. It will probably take you less time than it would take your grandmother. Because so this is something that, what is that? What is the hesitation with getting involved in the political process for a lot of young people?
Oh, well, okay. I guess one thing is that, people, and we see this all around as recent history goes, is that a lot of young people are not voting. That's just a reality that we face today. Whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, yeah, we can debate it, till the day is out. But the point is, I think our generation, what I personally see over the years is that a lot of the members of my generation have lost faith in just politics alone, or just there's not enough interest in that. Well, again, political right is also something that is given to every individual here in this country. And I think if we don't take advantage of the rights that we have, eventually it's just going to be another missed opportunity where we could have just utilized it appropriately to really make the change that are needed. And I think just on that basis alone, we also have to focus on why all this disinterest is happening. Well, can it be because of the fact that people are just simply busy these days? Maybe. Can it be because simply the fact that people are just not aware of a lot of things that are going these days? Maybe. But one thing is very clear, is that we are very, very we're in a very good society where if we really want to celebrate who we are as people, we can do that. And if there are challenges or obstacles in front of us, we can definitely address those things that are in front of us, and really maybe even come up with a solution sometimes. And so I'll share what I personally did, just so that we could maybe present something that's really relevant to everybody else. Is that a lot of students have asked me after the last Uyghur event that me and my friends, the college Republicans, have organized. They said, "What can we do? Is there a petition that we can sign? Can we call our representatives?" And then they said, "See, you have the answers right there. You do know what to do, right?" Mm-hmm. So we encourage you to really look into what you already know, and if it's something that you feel is right, then go for it. And I feel like, in a way, we have to thank the Uyghur people, despite all of the challenges that they're facing, is that they've really reminded us as Americans, as just regular Americans, as non-Uyghurs, I might even add, that how precious our rights are in this country, and how useful these things can be in terms of really making the changes that we talk about day and night, every single day. And that's another great tenacity that I've seen within the Uyghur people in general. It's something that we have to learn from. Just kind of sidetracking over here. As many of you might have guessed, I'm not Muslim. But that doesn't negate the fact that I can still participate in some sort of activity during Ramadan, especially, and one of the things that I did was I went to a masjid during a Jummah session where a day before one of our major Uyghur events on campus, and they gave us a platform, thankfully, to just kind of address the crowd after the Jummah prayers in an auditorium to really talk about this issue. And some of the congregants, after hearing what I have to say, where I told them that I come here not as a Muslim, I come here as a Christian, I come here as a complete outsider, but I also come here as a brother, and as your sons, your nephews, or whatever it may be, to really ask you to really let's do the right thing, and let's for once unite as a family, right? As we call ourselves all the time, as we can be, and to really make changes with and make changes with the Uyghurs. I even make the case that this could be a good stepping stone in really creating that harmony that we've been talking about in this country since the beginning of time, and that's something that we could do. And I think a lot of going back to your previous point is that students just a lot of times don't engage politically, also because they just have this preconceived notion that it's not relatable to them. Well, that's not true, because I'm not a Muslim, for example, right? But I also I was well accepted into Muslim communities to talk about these issues. Some of the even members of the masjid actually came up to me and a couple of my colleagues and said, you really shamed us today, because but this is a good shame, because you really reminded us of the importance of really caring for our brothers and sisters, which has already been there. So just by that alone, we've created that peaceful interaction that we always wanted. And through that, I firmly believe that, through the students' efforts, through things like that, we could really come up with changes that that Aydin and so many other people in the Uyghur community have been fighting for. Because let's be honest here, being disinterested is not helping us out anymore. And and the same regime that the Uyghur people have been struggling against all these years have caused pain beyond words by essentially causing this pandemic. In this entire globe. And so this is, I would even argue that this is more of a bigger reminder for us to really support the Uyghur cause and side with the Uyghur people as much as possible.
I do want to quickly comment. I know we're close on running out of time, but I do want to quickly comment on beyond just the, thank you, Se Hoon, for mentioning all of these ways to, raise awareness and preserve the culture and make sure that, this issue remains a priority, but also beyond just voting and calling Congress people. There's actually things you can do on your campus directly. And this is beyond just raising awareness on your campus, but really assessing your university's relationship with China. And we actually had an episode last week on how MIT has now cut ties with iFly Tech, which is a AI surveillance company that basically is in charge of voice recognition technology that was then used to surveil Uyghur people, and is a big reason why millions of people were rounded up into these camps and prisons. And with pressure coming from us and coming from people on campus and outsiders, they eventually cut those ties. And in that case, because for the longest time, MIT had been complicit in this genocide, and I think they're still partnered with SenseTime, which is in charge of facial recognition technology, but we're still pushing for that to be an issue that is seized. But that's an example of how American universities can be directly complicit, and so that's why we ask you to please assess your university's relationship with China, even if they're not partnered necessarily with a technology company. You can check to see if there are Confucius institutes on your campus, which are often funded by the Chinese government. Thereby, and they're yeah, and that's a way for the Chinese government to exercise their soft power on campus. You can then use, the fact that you're a student or you're related to that school, or if maybe you're an alumni, you can use that to be like, hey, this is the fact that the Chinese government is doing what they're doing, and this university is not saying anything about it. You can't, and what the university might respond and be like, oh, that's not our issue. That's not something that we need to be focused on because that's an internal affair of China. No, you can respond and say, no, this is not an internal affair because we are partnered with the same body that is exercising these horrific atrocities on these people. And it's our responsibility as an American university, that claims to be of moral value and freedom and equality and so on, for us to stand up against this. So I know I just graduated from Duke University, and I know Duke has a campus in China called the Duke Kunshan University. And, the fact that they have a university on campus is not really the problem. It's the fact that Duke has remained silent on what China is doing in East Turkestan. And that's what really bothered me. And I really wish if I could go back in time as a student is to really make that into a campaign or some kind of activity on campus. I would probably gather like students who are also passionate about the cause. Unfortunately, I was the only Uyghur person on campus, and I felt like I was always the one trying to tell other people what's happening because a lot of people didn't know. But if I could go back in time, I would actually, try to make this into a campaign, contact the administration, make this into something that a lot of people, and you'd be surprised, a lot of professors, a lot of administration don't actually have an idea of what's happening. You say the term Uyghur, they'll just be like, okay, they'll pretend they know what it is, but they maybe heard a couple of things, but they don't know the extent of it. And you don't have to be an Uyghur to be doing all of this. You can be, Se Hoon is you're not Uyghur at all. You're a Korean American, and you're standing up for China-related causes. People think Tibetans and people of the actual impacted population usually are the ones doing this, but that's not really the case. So really assess your school's relationship with China. I know USC, University of Southern California, has a U.S.-China Institute on campus. And I remember I had studied there for a semester, and during that time period, their entire website and their newsletters and their programming, this was in 2018 when I was studying there, this was when the Chinese concentration camps were at, in the media was at its peak and people were talking about it. But even then, I had requested that they prioritized this topic. And again, none of it was mentioned. So they had posted domestic issues that China is facing on their newsletter and their websites, but nothing was mentioned of what's happening in East Kyrgyzstan. And I remember this is another reason USC is complicit in what's happening, because this institute, whoever it's funded by, I didn't know who it was funded by, but it was clearly controlled by some body that didn't want to talk about the reality of what's happening in the parts that are experiencing genocide. So I think that's, a quick summary of what people can do. These are all things that, I've been talking about off the top of my head, but obviously you guys are all very creative. People have come up to me with really creative ideas using artistic skills. They're social media. Like, you don't have to be a public speaker in order to, raise awareness. You can do things low key and also make this into a conversation that you talk about at your dinner table. Let's not remain in our own bubbles and just talk about how hard it is to be quarantined. Not to kind of downplay our struggles. Obviously, this is a global pandemic that everyone's facing, but really putting into perspective the type of struggles people are going through on the other side of the world, and really trying to picture what that means for an individual, a family, an entire society, and the trauma that they're facing.
Just on that other point, one of the other things that we were planning to do, and again, this pandemic has really ruined it for us, but it can apply to for future Ramadan as well, is that one thing that I was planning to do was I was going to buy up all these sweets or box of dates, and then just and with the messages that says Ramadan Mubarak, during this Ramadan, please dedicate at least a prayer for the Uyghur people. And that would be much appreciated, and just go around the community and just give it there. And honestly, I'm a non-Muslim, and it's something that we could, it shows that it's something that we could all definitely participate in. And also at the same time, again, it does not matter what background you come from, because at the end of the day, the regime that caused all of the things that are happening to the Uyghur people, it's honestly affecting all of us right now, not just through the pandemic, but just so many other ways as well. And I think just my one last point is that we need to constantly remind ourselves is that China influences our lives every single day in one way, shape, or form. That's another reason for us to really care, and to really not look at it as an outside issue, because it has never been an outside issue in the first place. So
exactly. So many of our things that we buy in our homes, so much technology that we own is made there. And this is to say that this is something far removed from us would be hypocrisy at every level. So, and especially a lot of our audience is also overseas. And the fact that no newspapers talk about this, no editorials are published on this. There's a clampdown on any sort of just negativity on China because of their economic power in many of these countries is what is terrifying. Because what people don't understand is if you're already so indebted to and this happened to the United States as well. So we can learn from, as an American citizen, at least I have the freedom to complain about the empire, the U.S. empire, right? But China is building their empire and has built its empire across the globe now. And if people are not, cognizant of that and are not ready to talk about what price that comes with, right? I just recently saw in Nigeria that a chief of a Nigerian tribe, a Chinese man, was made the chief of a Nigerian tribe because of how much economic investments have been made in that area by, and so just really critically, students anywhere, in campuses anywhere, right? You don't have to be in the United States. You don't have to be in Australia. You can be anywhere in the world and still be talking about this and discussing this, holding events like Se Hoon is saying, doing online social media campaigns like Aydin suggested. Really research, offer up your skills. There's so much material out there that could be translated into all these different languages and distributed, right? A lot of people are behind a information blockade. Just like we are allowed to see this because, as things, suppose we were living under an era where the U.S. and the Chinese government had really good relationships, this conversation would not be taking place because, face it wouldn't have been. Like, maybe it might have been, but it would have been a really hard conversation to hold. So the fact that this is we're living in an era where the Trump administration is extremely upset with the Chinese government helps our cause. So let's use it. Use that anywhere in the world that you are. So that is something that I would seriously urge people. I can tell you myself, like, I was not an activist. I was a homeschooling mom. I wrote, I was a journalist, but my journalism was not about advocacy in that sense, right? And it wasn't until I realized, hey, this is something I can do. Anybody can do this. You do not have to be, like you said, a Muslim. You do not have to be a Uyghur. You do not have to be Muslim. You don't have to be an advocate to be able to speak truth, and especially to be able to speak truth to power. So I'm really grateful for you all to be for being here, and especially you, Se Hoon. We don't often see this cross-cultural and cross-racial, cross-religion activism. It's very and it's heartwarming for people who are going through oppression, and the people who feel like their brothers and sisters are going through oppression, to see someone who has nothing really invested in it to take this on as their cause. So I really appreciate you for that.
And I'd just like to quickly add, when I first met Se Hoon, we met through Facebook, and he had basically reached out to me, talking about his experiences on campus. And I was actually very, very touched to see, because I haven't met a lot of non-Uyghur people be this dedicated to the cause as Se Hoon has been. And I was like, to hear about his experiences on campus, and I know he didn't get to touch on it much today, but he talked about the harassment he had faced, the type of the complete disrespect and insults that he was facing for standing up to the truth. He had talked about the type of the pushback he got from the administration for trying to hold events on campus, and the list goes on. And so I want to say thank you, Se Hoon, for doing what you have been doing, and I hope you remain being a role model for other people on campus and around the world. And it's been really an honor to know you and and know what you've been doing on behalf of our people. And I know this is something that you've told me you've dedicated a lot of your life to this now, and I think you have you're already planning on what you're going to be doing next. And I know he had even started a type of initiative to compete, have the different schools compete with one another, and who can organize the best and most well-attended Uyghur awareness event. And that's just something that really shows the type of passion and dedication that we should all be having throughout this time. And so I just want to say thank you again, and just point that out.
Thank you so much. And again, thank you both of you for just having me. Just one last thing is that there is this really unexpected alliance that happened, touching upon the one point of outsiders coming in. There's this alliance called the Milk Tea Alliance, where it's consisted of people from Thailand, Taiwan, Vietnam, and now Korea. One thing that really unites them cross-culturally is the fact that they have milk tea. It's also known as bubble tea or boba. And the reason why that alliance was created was because the CCP has been very, very aggressive towards Thailand, especially, and these other countries. And again, it's just showing that so many people are frustrated with CCP's action, not towards the Chinese people, but towards the CCP and what they do. And so things like that are growing. I'm just one of many, many voices out there, but let me also say, as an outsider to the Uyghur people, on behalf of all of us, we are also sorry for being so blind and not, essentially not, giving a flying fig about what's been happening to you. Even this goes to the Tibetan people as well. There's just so much that we could have done. At least just think about this issue, and a lot of us are guilty of not doing that. And please know that we stand with you. And again, all of us may not agree on every single thing that's out there, but that's on an individual level. But I also say this as a fellow brother. I also say this as your family. We will stand with you until the end, and I hope all of you can come to please forgive us at one point, and that and I would also like to thank especially the Uyghur people for really reminding us the value of freedom that we have in our own country, and just in different environments that we have alone. And this has also shown that you really also, let me just remind your audience again, you don't have to be Muslim, you don't have to be Uyghur to at least even look into this issue. But whatever it may be, I would argue that it is the right thing to do, so that every single person in the future, be it man, woman, or a child, can enjoy the same type of rights, happiness that we all enjoy as the rest of us someday. And that really can start with the Uyghur people, as well as the Tibetans and other groups out there. And Ramadan Mubarak to everybody.
Oh, Ramadan Kareem to you too. This has been a very heartwarming conversation. Thank you, both of you, for joining us. And thank you to our audience for being here. We have been doing these shows every day for the past 2 weeks. And I want to hear from you. I want to hear what you want to hear about, what other topics that you want us to touch on these issues that we talk about, issues around the world. And we would love to hear your feedback. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'll see you here tomorrow on the Justice for All Now. Thank you.